Hello, everyone. Recently, I had the great displeasure of stumbling upon an article from 2012 from the Institute for Creation Research. This so-called institute endorses a biblical creation-based narrative for the creation of the universe, and they publish a whole lot of sophistry and ignorant garbage that they say disproves evolution and a lot of modern biology and geology and astronomy and so on. The article in question that thoroughly disappointed me and reduced my faith in humanity by a non-trivial amount, and which I'll now share with you. It's 6 years old, mind you, but this article is titled "The Scientific Case Against Evolution." The scientific case, remember that. Now naturally, I find the claims from the Institute for Creation Research to be, to put it politely, ignorant. I'll go through this offensively unscientific article and debunk all of the nonsense claims that it makes and all the misunderstandings that the author has about evolution. And as we go through this, hopefully I'll be able to clear up any confusion or lingering questions that anyone listening might have about evolution. And at the very least, it should be entertaining. To begin, let me briefly introduce you to the article's author, Henry M. Morris, PhD. Mr. Morris died in 2006, which was 6 years before this article was posted. So the Institute for Creation Research either has a treasure trove of this guy's inane ramblings and they're just posting a whole bunch of them until they run out of them, or they're just using his name as a placeholder for articles written by other authors long after this guy died. Now, this is a little weird, but it's not very substantial, so I'm going to move on. Henry Morris has a PhD, but it's not in anything remotely related to this article. He doesn't have a PhD in biology, or in genetics, or evolutionary science. He doesn't have a PhD in theology, or religious history, or philosophy. He has a PhD in hydraulic engineering, which apparently makes him an authority on biology and evolution, or so he'd like to think. This also supports the idea that the ICR, the Institute for Creation Research, is actually just a really seedy and disreputable organization. They name a guy as an author of a paper that was published 6 years after he died, and they're validating him as a PhD, but they don't actually say what his PhD is on their website. Presumably because if they did, people would wonder why a hydraulic engineer is trying to make a scientific case against evolution. Anyway, Mr. Morris led a storied life, where he started the Christian Heritage College, which has purposefully miseducated and misinformed its students about all things biological for almost 50 years now. He also helped start the Institute for Creation Research itself, which is the religious dogma propaganda station where I found this terrible article. Perhaps most notoriously, Mr. Morris wrote a book called The Genesis Flood, which is an attempt to scientifically validate creationism, like Noah's flood, and disprove more secular theories about the nature of reality. This book has served to misinform and confuse millions of people for decades since it was published, and it has served as the basis for most of the modern creationist political movement. Most of the stock arguments that you hear from creationists when you debate this kind of stuff, they come from this guy. So even in death, he's giving the middle finger to the scientific community. Alright, now onto the article itself. Right off the bat, Morris says that belief in evolution is a, quote, remarkable phenomenon. So in the first sentence, he totally dismisses evolution and suggests that it's remarkable that purportedly educated people, quote, believe in it. Believing in evolution is analogous to saying you believe in gravity, which is to say, you don't really need to believe in it because it's patently obvious. Saying that you believe in gravity sounds kind of weird because it's like, duh, you don't need to believe in that. It's not a faith issue. The evidence is all around you. The same is true with evolution, except it's just a little more subtle than gravity, and that's kind of why it slips by some people, like Morris here and his followers. He then goes on to say, and I quote, the lack of a case for evolution is clear from the fact that no one has ever seen it happen. If it were a real process, evolution should still be occurring, and there should be many transitional forms that we could observe, unquote. I mean, all of this is wrong, because we have seen evolution in real time. In dozens of labs across the country, bacterial cultures are raised in petri dishes and exposed to various artificially induced stressors as part of experiments, ongoing experiments. These stressors will kill many of the bacteria, but those who have resistance to the stressor will survive and reproduce, and the new population that now exists in the now will be different than the population that existed a day ago. Some populations of bacteria have been put through hundreds of stressors, and their current descendants hardly resemble the original founding bacterial population that was first put in the petri dish. The creationist response to this is usually something about micro and macro evolution. This is a false distinction that creationists just made up so that they can continue believing their creation story, because for some reason they seem to acknowledge, quote, microevolution, but not macroevolution. The thing is, there is no micro and macroevolution. It's all just evolution. The same processes work on both small and large scales. But with that said, even if you do just look for examples of so-called macroevolution, they still exist. We can and have seen this so-called macroevolution. A famous example is the scientific couple Rosemary and Peter Grant, who've studied the organisms on the Galapagos Islands for more than 30 years. It's some of the most impressive, most diligent, and continuous scientific work ever. It's their life's work. It's pretty amazing and inspiring. Among many other examples in their treasure trove of data, the Grants have recorded an instance where a single male finch of the species Geospiza conorostris landed on an island populated by smaller finches of the species Geospiza fortis. Now, I made a Science News episode about this when it happened. It was really interesting. I thought it was super cool. So this is how it happened. This male bird, this male conorostris, bred with two of the native fortis females, and they produced hybrids. When these hybrids grew up, they couldn't mate with the native fortis finches because they had different mating songs and they couldn't recognize each other as suitable mates. Instead, they became a reproductively isolated hybrid population, and they interbred. And within several bird generations, but well within a single human lifetime, they've established a blooming lineage of a new species. It's distinct, it's reproductively isolated from both the Geospiza conorostris and the Geospiza fortis finches. This new species of reproductively isolated hybrids are the product of evolution, or as the creationists would call it in this case, macroevolution. He also made some noise about transitional forms and a process that should be ongoing today. And I mean, evolution is ongoing today. Things are still evolving. Who said it ever stopped? Evolution never stopped. I don't know why there's this misconception in the creationist community that at some point in the recent past, evolution just stopped and it's not affecting us anymore. And that's an excuse to pretend that evolution just isn't real at all. I'll get into more detail in the transitional forms in just a few moments. Anyway, all of this evidence about the finches from the Galapagos Islands and all this, it wouldn't convince Morris. He goes on to say, and I quote, "What we see instead, of course, is an array of distinct kinds of plants and animals, with many varieties within each kind, but with very clear and unbridgeable gaps between the kinds. For example, there are many varieties of dogs and many varieties of cats, but no dats or cogs." Unquote. This argument about kinds is referencing a biblical quote, where it said that God organizes and arranges and divides animals and plants and other organisms according to their kind. If you were to try and put this in practical taxonomic terms, you wouldn't really be able to, because a kind is it's a very ambiguous and generic term that just groups together some arbitrary clade of organisms. Like all things that are founded on overtly religious principles, this concept of a kind breaks down with just the lightest scrutiny. So let's apply a little scrutiny. Morris mentions dats and cogs as these kind of weird intermediaries between cats and dogs, but he totally glosses over the actual animals that exist in reality that are related to cats and dogs. House cats, for example, are from the suborder Feliform, and dogs, like your pet Fido, are from the suborder Caniform. In each of these suborders, we can see a variety of animals that are closely related to the house cat, like the ocelot, the margay, and the leopard cat, which are all small and anatomically quite similar to the common house cat. But these other cats have more wild fur patterns, like they have fur and ear structures and paws and behaviors that are a little bit more like their larger kin, like the leopards, tigers, cheetahs, lions, lynx, and others among this larger extended cat family. Now, even further out, but still quite closely related to the house cat, are mongooses, meerkats, linsangs, and hyenas. These animals, especially the hyena, are closely related to the caniforms, like the wolves and house dogs. And if you go further out down this genetic line, down this end of the spectrum, you'll find bears, raccoons, skunks, foxes, and then even seals and walruses. All of these animals are quite different when you look at the extreme ends of the spectrum, like a bear on one end and an ocelot on the other, for example. But between the ends of the spectrum is the spectrum. There's this gradient of related animals, all very similar to their closest cousin species, but gradually changing as you go throughout this extended clade. Now, how does the taxonomic unit of the kind fit into this? No one has a scientifically valuable answer. Morris doesn't have a clear definition of what a kind is, at least not in this article. I mean, does it mean species? Does it mean genus? Does it mean a family? What does it mean? What is he talking about? Who knows? It's never defined. It doesn't matter because he's just making it up as he goes to justify his beliefs. Okay, so moving on, Morris quotes the so-called evolutionist. I hate that word, evolutionist. It's what the creationists call anybody who recognizes the obvious evidence for evolution. Anyway, he quotes this so-called evolutionist, Jeffrey Schwartz, cited as a professor of anthropology at the University of Pittsburgh, saying, and I quote, "It was and still is the case, with the exception of Dobzhansky's claim about a new species of fruit fly, the formation of new species by any mechanism has never been observed," unquote. Now, at the time this quote was made, you could possibly say that, maybe he just wasn't in the know. It was made in 1999, but since then, we've literally had 20 years of time to make discoveries, and we have indeed seen new species come into existence within a single human lifetime. I already mentioned one example in those hybrid finches on the Galapagos Islands. In Morris's article, this quote from Jeffrey Schwartz is cited, and so I looked down in the citations, and there's this link to a study about how the cell repairs DNA that's damaged by oxidative stress. Nowhere in this linked study can the attributed quote be found. The study itself doesn't really say what Morris thinks it says. Morris thinks this study disproves evolution because he misinterprets the data to think that it means that all of these DNA errors are just automatically repaired by the cell, and so that doesn't allow for mutations and genetic variation that leads to fitness variation and natural selection and all of that. But that's a total misrepresentation of the data. I mean, the study says the opposite of what he thinks it says. The study explicitly describes how severe oxidative stress can indeed create mutations during gametogenesis, and these wouldn't get repaired, and they would thus generate the variation that's necessary for natural selection to have its effects upon. Morris basically quote-mined a scientist, then illegitimately tried to validate his quote by citing some work by the author, even though the cited work doesn't include the quote, and it doesn't even support the point that Morris is trying to make. It's like this is amateur hour. Then Morris goes on to quote Ernst Mayr, a biologist at Harvard, who is quoted by Morris as saying that evolution was a historical science, and as such, quote, laws and experiments are inappropriate techniques, unquote, to explain it. Morris says that evolution is not real because it cannot be tested. You cannot, he says, see evolution in action. The problem here is that, again, Morris is simply wrong. First, you can see evolution and speciation happen. I already mentioned bacteria colonies and Galapagos finches, and he even mentioned a fruit fly experiment where a new species was generated. And that's not all. There's a lot more of this type of stuff out there. You just gotta look for it. Second, when Ernst Mayr says that evolution is a historical science, he's saying that evolution, or, if you'll humor me, macroevolution, generally works over long periods of time. So you're not going to get a dog to turn into a cat in the lab, because that's fundamentally just not how evolution works. And for Morris to suggest that something like this is how it is, just shows that he's really misinformed about what evolution actually is. If you want to think of something analogous that kind of illustrates how absurd and ridiculous this is, it's kind of like Morris denying the existence of tectonic plates and earthquakes, because there's no way that someone can replicate two tectonic plates in a lab and smash them together under laboratory conditions. Because no one can recreate massive sections of the planet's crust, he concludes that you can't find any data about them, you can't learn about them, and therefore they might as well not exist. I mean, it's ridiculous, and it's asinine to wield this floppy dildo of a criticism as if it was a sword, like Excalibur. I mean, what else can I say? It's just the most baseless argument ever. Okay, but farther along, Morris thinks he's got us, as he says, and I quote, "Evolutionists commonly answer the above criticism by claiming that evolution goes too slowly for us to see it happening today. They used to claim that the real evidence for evolution was in the fossil record of the past. But the fact is that the billions of known fossils do not include a single, unequivocal transitional form with transitional structures in the process of evolving." Unquote. Morris is using the transitional fossil argument, which, unfortunately for him, is a woefully inept and toothless argument that relies on a fundamental misunderstanding of evolution. Okay, so first of all, a little nitpick. He says that there's billions of fossils. If only we had that many. Maybe he's just exaggerating, but it just shows a kind of casual, flippant disregard for the actual data. That he's just kind of really just making it up as he goes. And that attitude permeates this entire article. Second, and more importantly, every fossil is a transitional fossil. Life perpetually and continually evolves. It's literally a continuous, perpetual process. Evolution isn't a discrete process, where animals and plants and fungus and whatnot just somehow, flip a switch or something and suddenly change. For example, if you have the fossils of a huge amphibious tetrapod that lived in the Paleozoic, and then you also had the fossils of an archosaur, a particular kind of dinosaur from the Mesozoic, and then you had the fossil of a bird from the Cenozoic. If you had all of these fossils, you're holding in your hand 3 transitional steps between the first land-dwelling tetrapods and modern birds. Those are transitional fossils. This whole transitional fossil argument really kind of irks me because it's just so stupid. Think of it through the metaphor of a Photoshop color palette. I've used this example before, but I think it's a good one, so here it is again. Imagine in Photoshop a very detailed color palette. You're looking at a gradient between a perfectly blue pixel and a perfectly red pixel. In between is a large gradient of colors with millions of pixels, gradually going from blue to purple to red. If you want to identify a transitional form between the blue and red pixel, then I would just point to the purple pixel in the middle. That's an intermediate. It's a transitional form. But then the creationist will just say, well, what about the transitional form between purple and blue, or purple and red? So then I would point to the middle purple-blue color, the middle purple-blue pixel, and the middle reddish-purple pixel. But then the creationist could just ask for more transitional forms, and on, it's recursive, until we get down to the individual pixels sitting adjacent to one another. Now, with respect to evolution, this is like someone repeatedly pointing to every fossil that we know of and explaining each fossil's place in this great transformational, evolutionary super process of life. And every single time they point to a fossil, the creationist just asks for more transitional fossils. They're chasing some missing link that they believe exists. But while they look for it, they just outright ignore all of the transitional forms that prove evolution, and totally disprove their criticism that there's no transitional forms in the first place. So they're just eternally moving the goalposts, and that's why it irks me, and that's why it's just so frustrating. So Morris then goes on to rant about the lack of transitional forms for a while. He outright omits any and all reference to all of the ancestral species connecting humans to the rest of the great apes. He just ignores all of the transitional species, like Neanderthalensis, Homo erectus. I made a huge comprehensive list in another episode, but there's a lot of them. There's like 24 ancestral species that we have, and this doesn't even go back much more than 3 million years. And we have 6 million years before we diverged from chimps, and then several million more years, in increments before that we diverged from gorillas, and then orangutans, and the rest of the primates, and the rest of the mammals, and blah, 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 blah. And they just deny all of it. He literally outright omits everything that demonstrates a connection between all living things. Morris keeps emphasizing transitional fossils, and how we've only found, quote, non-transitional fossils, unquote. He never really defines what this is, except for a throwaway line about feathered dinosaurs and walking whales. So maybe he's just referring to increasing scientific knowledge of the time that's reforming people's ideas of maybe older tropes about like dinosaurs and whales and stuff like that. Feathered dinosaurs are pretty well established at this point, but this evidence may have been compiled largely after Morris's death. So let's just go easy and give him a pass here. It's no big deal. However, the anatomical studies on whale bones that proved that they descended from land-dwelling mammals, that was known long before Morris died, so he has no excuse for denying that one. Additionally, his arbitrary labeling of fossils as non-transitionary is very similar to his arbitrary labeling of microevolution and macroevolution. Just as micro and macroevolution is a false distinction, it's just evolution. This concept of non-transitionary fossils is also total bunk. All fossils are transitionary, because all species, all living things right now, are in an evolutionary flux at all times. Some species evolve faster or slower than others, depending on a host of variables like average lifespan, reproductive age, time to maturity, clutch size, etc. But everything is still evolving. But Morris ignores this entirely, and he labels every fossil that he sees as non-transitionary. Not because that's what the evidence says, the evidence doesn't say that. But he does this because this is how he protects his religious beliefs. Morris says that he's writing a scientific case against evolution. It's right there in the title. But everything he's said so far, especially this kind of stuff, it's just incredibly unscientific. Moving on, Morris attempts to deconstruct the concept of abiogenesis, or how life initially began. He cites a researcher named Leslie Orgel, except I don't think he's being entirely honest when he quotes her. Morris says that Orgel doesn't believe proteins or nucleic acids could have arisen without the other, and whether or not they actually said this, it's not true. Amino acids and nucleic acids can form in all manner of places. They don't need each other necessarily. They can form in tide pools under a summer sun. They can form in hydrothermal vents. They can even form within the clouds of carbon that float in deep space, where UV radiation stimulates these carbon compounds to form reactions. NASA has been collecting evidence for literally decades that shows how these astronomical processes can create amino acids and nucleic acids out in space. Now, amino acids aren't proteins. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, and Morris specifically said proteins. But in this case, it's a distinction without a difference, because amino acids can be linked together without the help of nucleic acids. Morris quote mines Orgel again. When Orgel is talking about the RNA world hypothesis, Morris twists his words to imply he's saying that the hypothesis is impossible, but that's not what he's saying. About Orgel's misinterpreted claims, Morris says, and I quote, "Translation: there is no known way by which life could have arisen naturalistically," unquote. Again, this is wrong. We've learned a great deal about biochemistry and the chemical evolution of early self-replicating biochemical systems. For example, we know that cell membranes can spontaneously be generated. If some phospholipids are dumped into a polar solution like liquid water, the inherent nature of the chemical structure of these phospholipids will cause them to spontaneously arrange themselves into a stable form, where their hydrophobic regions have minimal contact with polar water molecules. This stable structure is a sphere, and it forms a cell membrane. It forms spontaneously, that is to say that it forms without any previous organization like architecture or infrastructure enabling its creation. It doesn't require an energy input. It's literally a natural, spontaneous formation that the phospholipids make. And this is critically important to understand. Because when you ask, how did the first cells come about? Well, those purely physical, self-replicating chemical reactions simply took place within one of these phospholipid membranes. That's how the first, most primitive cells came about. I mean, it's a little complicated, but it's really not that complicated. And if you learn even the basics of biochemistry, these physical chemical processes that make this possible become obvious. I mean, this really goes to show that Morris is just woefully unfamiliar with the actual data. Morris then moves on to attacking the Cambrian explosion, saying, and I quote, "Neither is there any clue as to how the one-celled organisms of the primordial world could have evolved into the vast array of complex, multicelled vertebrates of the Cambrian period." Unquote. Again, he's wrong. There's a lot of clues, and there's really good explanations for how these evolutionary events happened. As if to justify this absurd claim, Morris then goes on to misquote Stephen Gould, who said, "The Cambrian explosion was the most remarkable and puzzling event in the history of life." Now, when Gould says that, he's right. The Cambrian explosion is remarkable, and it is puzzling. There's quite a few legitimate scientific questions to be had. Like, for example, what triggered this explosion? Was it some kind of genetic threshold that when organisms passed it, it enabled them to massively increase in variability and modularity? Or was it some kind of environmental influence, like an increasing oxygen concentration in the atmosphere that enabled the growth of larger, more complex organisms? These are some of the legitimate questions about the Cambrian explosion, but Morris doesn't have legitimate questions. Morris deliberately misquotes Gould to make it sound as if Gould is questioning the entire thing, as if he thinks the Cambrian explosion is impossible, and that it never happened at all, that it couldn't happen. But that's just a straight-up misquote. I mean, that's just straight-up intellectual dishonesty. Next, Morris misquotes more scientists to imply that they're all saying the evolutionary story that's told by fossil evidence is just a mishmash of dead ends and contradicting data. It's as if he expected evolution to produce this really clean, really simple lineage of evolutionary history, where all the transitionary forms are discrete, sequential, and laid out as clear as day, and that's that. The problem with this preconception about evolution is that, to a huge degree, it's overly simplistic. It's reductionistic out the ass. It demands that evolution conforms to his simple preconception of how it should be, and then he denies evolution entirely when the data doesn't actually conform to this preconception. So the reason the fossil evidence appears as it does is because, 1, fossils are almost always incomplete. It's very rare to have a full skeleton be preserved and recovered. 2, fossils are rare. Soft-bodied organisms largely don't get fossilized, so we have very little fossils of fungus and many of the species before the Cambrian explosion. And 3rd, fossils don't represent the entire body of the organism or the species. I mean, this kind of takes 1 and 2 into consideration. The fossil only represents the hard parts of the organism's body, like its bones, or if it's like a woody plant, the wood, like a chunk of the stem or something. It doesn't represent all of the soft tissue. I mean, you can infer a lot about the soft tissue by learning about the skeleton, about the fossils, but there's a lot that we just don't know about the soft tissue. For example, we don't know what color dinosaurs are. We have, a rough estimate, but we really don't know. And for the longest time, until we found fossils with fossilized feathers, we never knew that dinosaurs even had feathers. That was new information that we learned recently. And when I say that fossils don't represent the entire body of the species, I mean that it's pretty rare for a dead corpse to get fossilized in the first place. I mean, most of the time a dead corpse will decay and rot away, and the bones will be crushed and eroded, and it just won't fossilize. Fossilization is a statistical anomaly. And so the bodies that we get in fossils of, the individuals that did fossilize, it's a biased sampling of all of the animals that lived at the time. We don't have fossils of soft-bodied organisms, and we only have the bodies of organisms that died somewhere where they're likely to be fossilized, like a swamp, or a marsh, or a bog, or some kind of coastal region, or near a floodplain, or somewhere where the fossil could get quickly covered with sediment, or mud, or something. There's coastal areas and wetlands everywhere, but compared to the entire planet, this is a relatively small geographic area. And so you can see why the fossil sampling is so incomplete and so poorly representative of all of the animals that existed in the past. Okay, so back to my list. Number 4. Divergence and speciation never stops. Evolution never stops. So if you were to look at the family tree of a particular clade over a period of like 5 million years, just for example, it would appear like a dense bush. You would have dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds of projections shooting off of this main branch everywhere, all the time, only for most of these projections to end abruptly as that particular evolutionary branch died out. I mean, maybe they last long enough to branch a couple times of their own, but eventually most of them die out. I mean, 99% of these offshoots will die pretty quickly. 99% of all life that's ever lived has died. And this is why we see groups of related fossils with minor variations among them, because you have all of these evolutionary offshoots and branches that kind of branch off of this main genetic lineage, this main stem, through a given period of time. Maybe you're looking at like this 15-year segment of the strata, and you can tell this story of this kind of random walk of the evolution of this species that lived there. Morris then moves on to assault DNA evidence and phylogenetics, and he starts by misquoting another scientist, in this case an anthropologist named Roger Lewin. Lewin said, and I quote, "The overall effect is that molecular phylogenetics is by no means as straightforward as its pioneers believed. The Byzantine dynamics of genome change has many other consequences for molecular phylogenetics, including the fact that different genes tell different stories." Unquote. Now, none of this is controversial. The field of genetics is massively complicated, and it's revolutionized our understanding of ourselves and of life around us. Genetics has validated evolution, and it's revealed the shared genetic heritage of all living things on this planet. But Morris misinterprets this quote to suggest that genetics doesn't support evolution at all because it, quote, contradicts fossil evidence, unquote. No, Mr. Morris, it does not. Just because genetics tells a story that's more complex than you want to hear, or more complex than you can understand, that doesn't mean that genetics is just a load of bullshit that you can dismiss out of hand. It means that you don't know what you're talking about. Morris concludes his article by saying that all of his facts prove that there's actually no scientific evidence for evolution at all, and it's silly to think so. There's no proof today, he thinks, or in the past. Evolution is, according to Morris, quote, an arbitrary system, built upon faith in universal naturalism, unquote. Now, evolution is neither arbitrary, nor is it based on faith. Evolution has very precise rules that describe how various aspects of it work, like gene flow, or molecular clocks, or founding populations, or natural selection. I mean, you name it. Morris ends his piece with the biggest load of bullshit yet. He says that this same evidence that disproves evolution also just so happens to prove the story of creation. And lo and behold, wouldn't you have guessed it, it proves the specific story of creation that Mr. Morris personally believes. Isn't that amazingly convenient for him? I mean, that's incredible. I think that's amazing. How lucky he is. Now, what's also convenient for Morris is that he explains how creationists will obviously predict big gaps between the God-created kinds. But then he says that within each kind, new varieties can emerge, which allows, and I quote, each basic kind to cope with changing environments without becoming extinct, unquote. This is fucking hilarious, because Morris just spent who knows how many hours writing this trash article about how evolution is wrong, and then he ends it by saying that evolution does happen within a kind. He called evolution arbitrary, and then he uses this totally arbitrary unit of measurement to define how and when evolution actually does happen. Wow. So this guy just immediately clings to any evidence that he can that reinforces his personal religious beliefs, or something that he thinks reinforces them. If there's evidence that doesn't support his beliefs, but if it can be twisted and distorted and misquoted into a weird kind of pseudo-support, then he does that right away. Now, where the evidence blatantly disproves him, and the evidence just, no matter what he tries, no matter what mental gymnastics he plays, the evidence can't be warped to fit his narrative, he just outright ignores it. And here, at the very end, we see that Morris is simply projecting his frustration, as he accuses evolution and evolutionists of suffering from the problems that, in reality, plague his own argument. Specifically, that is a dependence on misinterpreted evidence, or if you prefer, a total lack of evidence, as well as a lack of logical reasoning that forms any kind of coherent claims. Like he doesn't form a coherent series of claims. And lastly, just the arbitrary nature of the phenomenon. Morris claims that evolution is arbitrary, when it's blatantly clear that he was a delusional, irrational person who never developed the self-awareness to realize just how arbitrary his religious claims actually are.